Hello. So, to review our essential question for Unit 3, our essential question for Unit 3 that you see down the bottom here is we're looking at the ways that democracy, which is when people have a voice and people have a say in their government, how does that expand or change over time? So, in this lesson, we'll be talking about Jefferson and Jeffersonian democracy. So, this is Unit 3, Lesson 2. So, our lesson objectives for today, you can explain the origins of American political parties. We'll talk about what political parties are on the next slide. You can examine how the election of 1800 was the nation's first peaceful transfer of power. You'll be able to explain how Jefferson's political style created a long period of Democratic Republican rule and the end of the Federalist era. And lastly, you can explain how Marbury versus Madison expanded the power of the judicial branch. So, just to review, it's very common today in United States politics to talk about political parties. So, if you watch current events today, you'll hear of Democrats. That's one political party we have. And you'll hear about Republicans. That's our other major political party that we have. So, what a political party is it's an organization or a group that coordinates candidates to compete in a particular country's elections. Typically, they have common points of view on different issues. And the political parties will choose candidates that they think will be competitive in nationwide elections. There's also local elections and state elections. So, if you remember from our last lesson, we looked at Washington's farewell address. And in his farewell address, he said that political parties were a terrible idea, that all they would do was divide the country and divide the people. But even though he said that, we did not listen to Washington. So, two political parties will quickly emerge in the new country. We'll call them the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. So, it's a little confusing because they sound very similar to our political parties today, but Democratic Republicans was one political party, Federalist was the other. So Jefferson is the first Democratic Republican to win the presidency after John Adams, who serves as president after George Washington. So in the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson takes office. The House of Representatives elected Jefferson, and he's inaugurated in March of 1801. This was a very highly contested election. Adams and Jefferson, who, if you remember, worked on the Declaration of Independence together in 1776, but now they are bitter enemies. They are completely different with points of view, different with their vision of what United States, what our country should look like and focus on. But Jefferson is the more popular candidate with farmers and people that aren't necessarily the white, wealthy, rich elite like Federalists are. So, the significance of Jefferson's election is even though Washington wasn't a Federalist, he was kind of a Federalist, and Adams was a Federalist. So, now for the first time, we have a transfer of power between political parties, which many people on the outside looking into the United States didn't think that was possible, especially Great Britain. So we're able to show that, we can have different points of view, but still continue the idea and the government that is the United States. So I have a little clip here from Jefferson's inaugural address. So this is when he's sworn in as president, he gives a speech, and this is what he said. But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. I know indeed that some honest men fear that a Republican government cannot be strong, that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot, in the full tide of successful experiment, abandon a government which has so far kept us free and firm on the theoretic and visionary fear that this government, the world's best hope, may be possibility want energy to preserve itself? I trust not. I believe this, on the contrary, the strongest government on earth. I believe it the only one where every man, at the call of the law, would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. So take a minute and look at the part that's highlighted and answer in your notes, what do you think that Jefferson meant by "we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists"? So Jefferson was much different than Adams. Adams saw the presidency as not so much a king, but the figurehead of the government. He did not like the fact that people wrote bad things about him. He did not like the fact that he was attacked in the newspaper daily. But Jefferson looked at it as, hey, this is the United States, and we have the idea of freedom of speech. We have the idea of freedom of the press, and people are able to have their own opinion, which is one thing that makes the United States so great. So Jefferson kind of dials back Adams' style. He's very, a lot more casual. He really believed in the idea of separation of power. So he did not give speeches to Congress. He allowed Congress to operate on their own. Just like George Washington, he wanted to be addressed as Mr. President. And even though he believed in the government being strong at the national level or the federal level, he worked to reduce the size of the federal government. He reduces the size of the army. He dressed very casually. He greets guests at the White House himself, opening the front door, which, today would be completely crazy if we think about it. President Biden is not opening the door for guests at the White House today. He has staff, he has security, he has all those things. So it's just a very different presidential style. And it was a very different time period also. So leading into the idea that he reduces the size of federal government. He also saw that up until his election, most of the people that were making decisions were Federalists, that other political party. But instead of taking their ideas and completely overturning them, which is what you would think somebody of a different side would do, he tried to integrate the Republican ideas into policies that Federalists had already put into place. One thing in his efforts to reduce the size of the national government, he begins to pay off the federal debt that we've had since the American Revolution. How does he do that? Well, he cuts government spending. He cuts what the government is spending on. He does away with the whiskey tax that we talked about in lesson one that really angered Western farmers who were, relying on whiskey to make their money. Um, and also, he plans one of the things, if you reduce the size of the federal government, one thing you won't be able to pay for is the military. So he says, you know what, we'll use local militias like we did in the Revolution instead of having a full on standing United States Army. So, lastly, we're going to take a look at a really important Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison. So, during John Adams' time as president, another Judiciary Act is passed. We talked about a Judiciary Act under Washington, but the Judiciary Act in 1801, passed by a Federalist majority in Congress, creates 16 new federal judges. That's a significant amount. Before leaving office, it's the job of the president to appoint judges, and then they are approved by Congress. So Adams appoints people that agree with him. He appoints Federalists to these positions. So on the other side, you have Jefferson and the Republicans who are unhappy that the Federalists controlled the courts. After Jefferson takes office, Congress, now under control of the Democratic Republicans, repeal the act, doing away with this idea of these midnight judges. Midnight meaning like at the last possible moment that Adams had power, he tried to put a bunch of people that supported him into these offices. John Adams had chosen John Marshall to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He serves for 34 years overall. But one of the things he does with the case Marbury versus Madison is he makes the Supreme Court a much more powerful independent branch of the federal government than had been written under the Constitution. So ultimately, the significance or importance of Marbury versus Madison is the ruling where Marbury, who was one of those judges that Adams had appointed, was removed from his position. He sues to say it's rightfully his. And John Marshall decides that It's the job of the Supreme Court to strike down laws if they are not constitutional. So it strengthens the court. The really important thing is that thing you see there in the second sentence. The rule and strengthen the court because it asserts the rights of judicial review, the power of the Supreme Court to decide if laws passed by Congress are constitutional and to strike down laws that were not. So that is a power that the Supreme Court still holds today. They are one of our three branches, and they have the ability to take a law or an executive order passed by the legislative and executive branch and have the ability to strike it down if they think it does not follow under the Constitution. After you've completed your practice for this lesson, look over your notes and you will be ready for your mastery check. Your notes are important because you'll be able to use them as your mastery checks. But at this point, other than your tests, I'm only grading mastery checks. So please make sure that you take good notes so you'll be prepared for those. If you have any questions, I'm always here to help you.